Good evening, and welcome to the City of Mount Pleasant Historic Board and Building for those of you who have not been here before. My name is Nancy Ridley, and I'm the City Manager for Mount Pleasant. And tonight's presentation is about providing a framework for understanding some municipal finance funding issues in the state of Michigan. So our purpose tonight is really twofold. First, we have a presentation to help educate about some of the funding challenges that are not only facing Mid-Michigan, but the state as a whole. And although many of us in Mid-Michigan have not been harmed from a local standpoint as much as some of the entities in Southeast Michigan, we're also finding that we're not rebounding quite as quickly either as the economy recovers. And secondly, tonight's presentation is to give some perspective on some potential solutions we believe exist statewide to address some of those issues. So one of the reasons most of us up here that work in local government chose our professions is because we believe at the local level we can make an impact. We also believe the reason most of you chose where you live is because locally you made some choices about the kinds of services or programs that you wanted in a community. So we believe that we working together can make the best impact to make our state the great state that it can be. So the Michigan Municipal League has been holding these presentations around the state, and we're happy tonight to be a host site for these presentations. And the Michigan Municipal League has been a champion in trying to get this word out statewide. So tonight we have Tony Minghine from MML, who's done this presentation a number of times, and he quite frankly is going to do the bulk of tonight's presentation. And when he's complete with that, then we have individuals from Mount Pleasant, Clare, and Alma who are going to give a quick overview of the impact on those three mid-Michigan communities, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers that any of you may have. So when we get to that part, Marianne Cornexel is to my left. She's the City of Mount Pleasant Finance Director Treasurer. She'll be doing the City of Mount Pleasant impact. Phil Moore is the City Manager from Alma. Next to him is Ken Hibble from the City of Clare, and next to him is Carla Swanson, who's one of the City Commissioners in Clare. So we've got some of our great neighbors with us tonight to go over this with us. So Tony has been doing this presentation, as I indicated, throughout the state. He has 25 years of combined experience in local government, and he's an expert in operational and financial issues relating to municipalities and nonprofits. So as part of the League's SaveMICity initiative, Tony travels extensively, helping us to educate people about Michigan's system for funding being broken and solutions on how to do it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tony for his presentation.
Thank you. I'll apologize in advance for turning my back to you. But I'm Italian, so I can't sit and talk. I apologize. So I appreciate this opportunity to talk about this. This is a really important issue and something that's impacting communities all across the state. And about a little over a year ago, the League decided to make this a big educational issue for getting outside of our membership, because our members understand what we're going to talk about tonight. And the thing that we think is really important is that people in the community, businesses in the community, really understand what's going on and come to the realization that we all have a dog in this fight and trying to figure out what it is we can be doing differently. So with that in mind, I'm going to blow by this stuff. You know, when you think of great places, we all know what they look like, and there's different places around the state and different places you think of. And we all know it when we see it. And that's what we're all trying to create. And that's what we're all looking for, because that is an important aspect of any community. And it's what draws you to a place. The problem is right now, because we've been disinvesting in local government, we see just frankly too much of this. And a lot of the inability to invest in our communities is creating places that aren't the places that we talk about, that don't resonate with us, that you don't feel invested in or you want to be a part of. And everybody in this room, wherever you lay your head at night, you chose that for a reason. It meant something to you. And what we got to maintain that. We've got to figure out a way to invest more in our communities to do that. So what's happening to Michigan cities, and why do the people in this room care, or should you care? Our municipal finance model is broken. And it is severely impacting our community's ability to provide services. Services you all count on, as residents, services you count on as businesses. And that is the underpinning of our economy. And that's something that we've really lost sight of in this state. Without strong communities, you cannot and will not have a strong economy. We've got to keep our communities strong. So what are some of the issues that we think are in need of addressing? The big overarching issue that we have in Michigan is our system does not track with the economy. So right now we have a relatively strong economy. If you think about your own personal well-being or your business, you're probably saying times are going pretty good right now, your 401's back. You know, in general, things feel like they're improving. And you probably assume that those things are translating to your community, and they're not, because our system isn't built that way. And I'm going to talk about why that is. At the state level, we have had a long and sustained policy of disinvesting in our communities. We have diverted money away from local services, channeled them to the state bureaucracy. And I understand the arguments as to why maybe that should have occurred. We would suggest we'd get a lot more bang for the buck investing those dollars locally, and we'd have more of an all ships rising situation. So we're going to talk about that. A lot of the problems that locals have, the quick and easy thing is to look at the folks behind me here and say, well, fix it. Just take care of it. A lot of these problems are too big or impossible. They don't have the legal authority to fix locally. So we're going to need the state to be a partner in addressing some of these issues. And something else we need to think about is in Michigan, we don't have enough tools in the toolbox. I get the opportunity at the league to go around there. Every state in the country has a league, like Michigan does, with the exception of Hawaii. And so I get a chance to interact with the different leagues, and so I get an understanding of some of the things they can do in other states. They have the ability to do things that we just don't have here in Michigan. And we've got to start thinking, what additional tools can we provide local governments that would help with this situation, help in providing services? So we've got to think more broadly about that. And we've been advocating around a three-tiered approach. So this isn't just about give us more money. Having good and real conversations about cost containment has to be part of this conversation. Looking at the structure of how we deliver services, that has to be part of this conversation. And there's no doubt that the revenues need to be addressed. So I just want to provide some facts, provide some context to this, just so you understand the magnitude of what we're talking about, how severely these issues are impacting the folks behind me. I thought it was you, but I'm not sure. It's just like something. Okay. So I just want to give you some facts that you guys can have just to understand in a broader way sort of what's really impacting and how severe these situations are. So this graph, and it's going to unfold here over the next minute or so, this graph represents total revenues for local government from all sources from 2002 to 2012. And this is census data. This isn't data that the league put together and massaged to make it look really doom and gloom. This is census data, and all we've done is report it out. And what you're about to see in a minute is Michigan is the only state in the country providing less resources to local government in 2012 than they were in 2002. 10 years later, less revenue, almost 9% less revenue. The average increase is about 50%. Just like businesses are competing with other businesses, cities in Michigan are competing with cities in other states to attract people here. It is impossible to compete when that's the reality. And ladies and gentlemen, that is our reality. We've got to think differently. We need to invest in our communities. If you look at the dollars that flow from the state, in most local budgets, the second biggest revenue source that you'll see is revenue sharing dollars. And those dollars flow from the state down to local governments. Again, 50th in the nation. Revenues are down over 56%. This graph depicts our tax system. I'm going to talk in more depth about this before, but we have two constitutional limitations here in Michigan. We have the Headley Amendment and Prop A, both of which have the underlying intent of capping growth at inflation or 5%, which makes sense, good policy. No one wants to see runaway growth, taxes that people can't afford. Headley was enacted on a community-wide basis. And that stood in place for almost 20 years. And then they started realizing that there was some inequities there because your taxes might have gone down or stayed the same. Yours might have gone up 30%, and so you're really struggling to make that. So Prop A got passed. Prop A did a lot of things. It provided additional school funding. That's when sales tax went from 4 cents to 6 cents. But from a local property tax perspective, it put in place individual caps. And so those are where you sell your house or you get that report, right, and it says my taxable value is X and my SEV is Y, and SEV being the value and the taxable being the other. What we now know, and I guess the truth of the matter is we knew before, but it didn't matter because property values always rose, post-recession, just how flawed the way that system was implemented is. And this graph tries to depict that. So in 2014, we are basically operating at 2005 taxable values on a statewide basis. Some places lost 50% or more of their value. I was just in Romulus a few weeks ago. Their taxable values, you've got to go back to the early 90s to find taxable value, though. That's how far they've fallen. And so the question, the natural follow-up question is, well, when does it get back? When does it come back to where it was? And the answer to that question is never. Because this is still continuing on at inflation. I'm sorry, I realize I'm pointing at the one I can see and not the one you guys can see. So inflation is still continuing along this path. And this can only grow at the same rate. So it never catches up. Your city is always operating at this 10-year or longer horizon window. System doesn't work. Good news is we can fix it, and it's not a constitutional fix, and it would not undermine the intent of Headley or Prop A. But we can fix that on a go-forward basis. And I think it's imperative that we do. I'm personally of the opinion that our communities will not survive another significant recession unless we address some of these issues. And I'll talk more about that solution in a little bit. So when you talk about revenue sharing, this is a second biggest issue there, okay? We've lost statewide almost $8.1 billion. $8.1 billion, money that should have flown from the state down to local government that was diverted to fund the state bureaucracy instead of local services. When you start to look at what these meant to individual places, Alma, $5 million, Clare, $1.4 million. Where's Mount Pleasant? I can't see it in this thing.
Top.
Oh, look at that, right in the top. Almost $13 million. 8.1 billion is hard to get your arms around. But you can probably imagine what Mount Pleasant could have done with almost $13 million. It's impactful. And it makes a difference because those are the services that you guys use every day. Those are the services that define your community. And those are the things we're just investing in. We got to start thinking differently. Where do we invest to get the most bang for the buck? One of the things that we like to say is that, well, we had to have shared sacrifice. There wasn't money to share. That's not true. During that same period of time, state revenues were up in total about 29%. And as I already told you, they cut local revenues 56%. We carried more than our fair share of the burden. We need to start thinking differently about how we utilize the limited resources that we have. What matters most? What will get all ships rising? This is just some of the departments that saw increases during that period of time. So you can see there were areas that did have the opportunity to grow. Local government did not share in that prosperity. And that's creating a very significant problem for us as a state, in our economy as a state. This is unemployment, and I apologize for this, but the fonts that when I sent the PowerPoint over, I forgot to send the fonts with this, so that some of this isn't projecting the way I'd like it to. But this is total employment for all local government and schools as well. Now, government is the quintessential service organization. They don't make anything. So less people equals less service, period, end of sentence. We are significantly lowering the people that we have in local government providing the services to all of you. Again, 50th in the nation. We are competing against our neighboring cities and our neighboring states, and in every category, we are 50th in the nation. Hey, we're not 50th in this one, we're only 37th. This is a change in per capita wages for local government officials, okay? So you could have the reaction, well, that's great, we're paying people less. This speaks to who you're able to attract into the profession. Folks behind me have been doing this for a long time, and we're lucky to have them. I know all of them well, and they do a great job for all of you. But what we're not seeing is the folks behind them, the generation behind them. We're not attracting folks back into this profession like we used to, because we're making it less and less and less desirable to do this. In Michigan, we have changed our mantra from trying to be the best into being the cheapest. That's our goal right now. Everything we do is centered around the idea of, can we do it for less dollars than we did it for yesterday? That's why you see our roads crumbling. That's why you see a lot of different things that are happening. Rather than thinking about investing in those critical resources. When you look at payroll, so you saw that slide a little bit ago, where the state revenues were up about 29%. When you look at their payrolls during that period, it's almost a one-to-one. Their payrolls were up 24% during that period from 2002 to 2012. When you look at all local payroll, cities, villages, townships, and counties, down about 14%. And when you isolate just the cities and villages, we're down almost a third. Almost a third. Again, you can think about every one of those as a direct correlation to services. So if you wonder why something's not getting done that was done years ago, that's your answer. So if you're wondering what other folks in the business say, Close Up is a survey done by the University of Michigan. They do this every year. They survey local officials around the state, and they try to gauge what the mood of the thing, or what are some of the issues we're thinking about, how do we see the future, just trying to get their arms around some of that stuff. So when they did it last year, they asked local officials, do you think that our municipal finance system is broken? What do you think? And 64% of the folks they talked to said, yeah, we do think it's broken. We absolutely think it's broken. 82% wants the state to address unfunded mandates, something that Headley did that I didn't talk about earlier. Headley, when it put the limit on property taxes as a protection against for local governments, I should say, put in place a requirement that they would have, the state, would have to fund anything they asked locals to do post-Headley that cost money as a protection to make sure they weren't going to just continue to put burdens on and not have the dollars to provide it, because they were limiting local government revenues. That never happens. That never happens. That's a big issue around the state. There's been a lot of things that have been mandated by the state, pushed down to locals. Funding doesn't exist for that, exacerbating the problem. 76% would support Headley reform. And I want to clarify, when we talk about Headley reform or Prop A reform, in no way, shape, or form are we suggesting we would repeal those things. Those are actually good, sound fiscal policies and put in place great protections for the folks in this room. But we messed up when we implemented that, and we need to fix that. And I'm going to talk about that solution in a minute. And 66% would support more local revenue options. This kind of gets back to that more tools in the toolbox that I talked about earlier. We need more things to do here in Michigan, more options. And we don't have them. And in Michigan, for those of you who don't know this, in some states they have true home rule, which means the city can do anything they choose to unless it's prohibited. In Michigan, we don't have that. We call ourselves home rule cities, but we need to find statutory authority in law to do anything. So if the state doesn't say we can do it, we can't do it. So our hands are literally tied in our ability to do things. So even if every citizen in a city said, we want to do X, if the statutory authority doesn't exist, you can't do it. And so that's some of the stuff when we say more tools in the toolbox that we're thinking about. So what about the public? You would expect local officials to say, you know, this is terrible and we got to fix it, it's awful. So Last election cycle, we, in some of the million surveys that folks were getting pulled off the couch to answer, we funded a couple questions to try to gauge the public's view of some of this stuff. So we participated in an EPIC MRA poll, and some of the findings we thought were interesting. So I'm sorry, jumping ahead of myself. 48% of the people they talked to agreed or felt that local government is underfunded. They are seeing it, and they understand the issue deep enough to say, yes, we think local government's underfunded. 52% said they would support higher taxes, not for new services, but just to continue to have the services that they have now. Because most people do understand the value of a good city service that translates into property values, that translates into just a sense of place, a community I'm proud of, a community I want to raise my family, and they get that. And they're willing to pay for that. 65, this is my favorite one, 65% disapprove of the state's diversion of revenue share. It's not my favorite for the reason you think, not because 65% agreed, but 65% knew what revenue sharing was. So that got me excited. And 48%, and this goes back to my original point about tracking with the economy, almost half the people said, you know what, I would expect in a strong economy to see my taxes go up a little bit. But we've built a system that doesn't allow that to happen. And I've been around long enough to know that's how it used to work. We'd go through cycles, and you'd have a couple tough years. And then, you know, the economy come back, and we'd have a couple years where we could make capital investments. We could do some things, catch up on the police car we didn't replace, fix whatever it might be. Those days are gone. There's never that recovery time. We've built a system that only works in a downward direction, has no upward mobility. That is fundamentally fatal. We got to fix that, and we can. So what can we do? This is not in any way any exhaustive list, but just to give you an idea of some of the things we've been thinking about and some things we could do differently here in Michigan and really change, I think, the future for us. So we've been talking over again around 3 points. I just want to drive this home. Looking at cost containment strategies has to be part of this conversation. There are things that we could be doing better, and we should take advantage of those opportunities to look for ways to contain and control costs. We need to think about the structure of how we deliver services. In a lot of ways, we really have built a model there that doesn't work very well either, and there's some ideas we have around that. And revenues absolutely, unequivocally need to be part of this conversation. By the way, that doesn't necessarily, you shouldn't hear that as let's raise your taxes. What do we do with the resources we have? Where do we invest the dollars to get the most bang for the buck? We got to think and ask ourselves that question and be honest about what the answer to that should be. So, first and foremost, we have got to fix our property tax system. So I talked a little bit ago about this idea. We have these 2 constitutional amendments. There are 2 things that happened when Prop A passed that didn't occur before Prop A. One of them results in having less than inflationary growth. So you know how now, when I talked about it earlier, you have the taxable value and the SEV, right? And so when you sell your house, person buys your house, what happens to their taxes? Right? They go up because they pay on that new value. And the city gets all the benefit of that new money, right? No. Because what happens is they take those values. Remember I said Headley works for the community-wide? So they take those values and they roll that into how they calculate your Headley adjustment. And the effect of that is to lower the millage rate to negate the gain that they saw. So that person thinks they're paying full freight, and you guys all got a 13-cent tax cut, and the city ends up with less than inflationary growth because of how that math problem works. That wasn't done by a vote of the people. That was done by the implementation legislation that happened when they passed that. So we can fix that. The other thing that happened when they instituted Prop A, the Headley Amendment would go up and down. So remember my comment about tracking with the economy, right? So in tough times, and you have less than inflationary growth, if your millage had already rolled back, so for those of you who don't know, you start off with a limit in your charter, and if the Headley, they call that a Headley rollback. If you have greater than inflationary growth, they lower your millage rate so you don't get more than inflation. So you might have been at 20 mills, it may have rolled back to 15 mills over time. But in less than inflationary times, that millage rate had the ability to move in the other direction, never past the charter limit, so never getting outside of what the citizens had approved. Prop 8 took away the upward mobility. So you get in a situation where we had all these declines, so we already had the millages roll back, and then we see the declines. What happens is that gets frozen down there. The freeze occurs because of Prop 8, because that's the other thing now, right? So everybody's individual homes is locked in at that, wherever it falls to. You're capped at inflation or 5% on the growth side, no limit to how far it can fall. So when you see, if you remember that graph that showed that dip down there, that's why that dip never comes back. Because those are locked in at inflation or 5%. Fixing the Headley thing would allow some tempering of that. Those are things we can do statutorily. It will provide a different trajectory for the future. No one's taxes would go up tomorrow, but it would provide some good and real protection for the next recession. And we all know that's coming. I don't know if it's next year, 5 years, but we've all lived in Michigan long enough to know it's coming. We got to think about how we can fix that. Very important that we look at that seriously. This is a big issue right now. OPEB is a fancy way of saying retiree health care. It's a very emotionally charged issue. It has real significant economic impacts and real significant human impacts. We have about an $11 billion unfunded OPEB obligation at the local level in the state. It's funded on average at about 14%. So in other words, of the dollars we think we need, on average we have about 14% of that today. It's a problem. But there are things we could do that would significantly impact that in a positive way in terms of lowering that economic cost and still provide a good benefit to folks that have worked and have earned and should expect to have health care in their retirement. But we have a very, in a lot of places, this is not uniform, but we have a very antiquated delivery model for some of that stuff. We could modernize those plan designs. We could do a lot of things that would significantly lower that cost and provide real budget relief. Because a lot of this, because of how unfunded it is really paid on a pay-as-you-go, which means instead of providing services with the dollars I collect in taxes, I'm using it to fund these legacy costs. And this was a problem 50 years in the making. So, I mean, but the reality is it's where we are today. And we've got to hit the reset button and think, how can we do this smarter, protect those individuals, and at the same time not devastate local budgets to do that? It is truly the undoing of some communities right now. And there's a lot of energy and talk around Lansing trying to figure out a way to address this, right? I'm just glad that wasn't me. Phil.
Sorry about that.
You have to stay after school now for that. So. But that's an important issue, something that we think is definitely needed addressing. The governor has put together a task force. I've actually been participating in that on behalf of local government. And there's a lot of other sort of conversations going around that. So big issue. Hopefully we'll see some positive movement that meets all the objectives that we've sort of laid out for that. We got to start thinking about investing in communities instead of a cut-only strategy. Let me explain what I mean by that. Local government, so I'm going to walk through the revenue picture again just to drive that point home. On average, about half their money comes from property taxes. We just got done talking about how constrained those are, okay? Second biggest, usually about 25%-ish, 25 to 30%, is revenue sharing. Talk to you about how much that's dropped off. The rest are sort of miscellaneous fees and things like that, most of which are constrained by something called the Bolt decision, which limits how you can set fees. So you can't really do anything like that for revenue generating purpose. So revenues are absolutely constrained, which means when the folks behind me have a budget issue, there's only one way to fix it. Cut. Got to cut my budget. When you first have a problem where it's not a big problem, cuts are easy, no one notices. You know, over time, the cuts become real, and they become noticeable. When they become real and noticeable, they start to have a negative impact on your community. Your community becomes less desirable than it was yesterday or last year. And then what ultimately happens? Taxes are a function of two things, millage rate and what? Is anybody paying attention? What is it? Value, right? I take my millage rate, apply it against the value of my community, and that's how much taxes I get. So at some point, the cuts that I'm making to balance my budget have the exact opposite impact that I want them to have. Because those cuts are damaging my revenue generating capacity. And if you look at the hardest hit communities around this state, you can see that in living color. Right? Services get cut to a point that no one wants to move there. People that are there are trying to figure out how to get out. Services decline, and it becomes a runaway train, and you can't stop it. But that's the only tool we have right now to balance budgets. I mean, I like to liken it, if I was in a private business environment, and I'm a turnaround guy, and I show up on Friday, and I'm like, what's going on? Man, this budget's just completely out of balance. I don't know what we're going to do here. And I'm like, you guys go home. You come back in on Monday, and I'll this all fixed. In one weekend, no problem. I got this. I'm good. You come in on Monday. Did you balance the budget? Oh, yeah. Your payroll was too high. It was easy to fix. What'd you do? Oh, I closed all your factories. You guys have a good day. Well, wait a minute. That's how we make our money. You took away our revenue generating capacity. And that's exactly what we do at local government. We encourage them to damage their revenue generating capacity by cutting the services, which is the exact thing that everyone's paying for. We got to think differently. We got to reimagine this so we can provide an investment model. Because the true way to fix this is if we can raise the value of a community, now it becomes self-sustaining. And we do that by making them stronger, better places, not by disinvestment. We got to think differently about how we do this stuff. We can't continue to build and abandon infrastructure in the state. We have, in the last 20-ish or so years, quite literally doubled our infrastructure. Doubled it. Roads, sewers, all that stuff. Doubled it. You know how many people we've added? None. We've been pretty flat in our population growth for decades. Now, you don't got to be very good with numbers to know if I got the same number of people trying to support twice the infrastructure, right? It's going to be on the test, so hey, pay attention. He's not even looking up. So. Are you in trouble? Do you have to come here in trouble, or are you just into this stuff? So, okay. But, right, you don't have to be a numbers person to do that math problem and go, I think that could be a problem. But that's exactly what we've done here in Michigan. What if we fully leveraged the infrastructure that we had before we built new? There are examples in this state where we have excess capacity on this side of the line, and not only did we build new infrastructure on the other side of the line, we gave them a grant to do it. Is that a good use of our resources? I don't think so. Again, thinking about it in kind of a business environment. If I got a factory at 50% capacity, and I got a new contract, and I run back and I tell Phil, my partner, I got great news, I got a new contract. Oh, that's great, we're going to be able to fully utilize the factory now. No, man, I want to build a new one. Well, that doesn't make any sense. We do it in local government all the time. We do it in local government all the time because we've incented that behavior. In Michigan, what we call growth is I build something new. It doesn't matter if they left town A to build it in town B. Town B gets that benefit, the growth of that. We call that growth in Michigan. So this community loses, this community wins, but that's not growth. Moving jobs from this side of the state to that side of the state, that's not growth, but that's what we kind of count it that way here. We got to start thinking differently about that. What we need is true growth. True growth is attracting people back to Michigan. We've remained flat in population for the most part, which means we've lost ground. And if you have any doubt that that's the truth, what's happened to our congressional delegation in this state? Right? Continues to go down. That's a fixed number, which means they reallocate them across the country depending on where people live. So we are, by staying flat, we are losing ground. We are losing influence. If this state would have kept pace since 1980, any guess how many people would live in Michigan? About 10 million now. It would be 14 million people. And that's just keeping pace. Forget those places that have grown beyond that. Just keeping pace. How different is our economy with 14 million people living here, buying things, vacationing here, all those things? 14 million people. That's a different Michigan. That's a different economic reality. We have every strategic advantage except for one. We have tremendous universities. Our universities are hailed around the country, some of the best in the world. We have good schools, natural resources. Nobody can compare with us. You know what we don't do? We don't invest in our communities. I use this example all the time. I have family that has relocated to Phoenix. It's hotter than the surface of the sun. They have no water. And people are moving there in droves. Why is that? Go to Phoenix. They're investing in that community like crazy. They are providing the things and the services and creating that place that people care about. So in spite of every reason to not go, people are going there. And their economy's growing and values are improving. We should be kicking their butts. And we're not. We've got to think differently. We've tried different models. We've tried tax cuts. We've tried a lot of things. We have created a very favorable environment. There's no impediment to locating here, except that one. We've got to start thinking differently about it. It's imperative that we do that. Because if we invest in our communities, that's what's ultimately going to drive our economic engine. Businesses will go where the people and the talent go. We've seen it time and time again. And people go to communities that they feel good about, that they want to be a part of. You guys came here for that reason. Maybe you've been here your whole life. But there's things about this that have brought you here. We need to continue to raise that bar and get people back here. This is an old example, but it's still true today. When Volkswagen of America relocated from Auburn Hills out to the East Coast, it was more expensive real estate, less favorable tax environment. Everything about the move was more costly. And when they asked their CEO, why are you going? He said, because that's where I can attract the talent I want. And what we're seeing happening here in Michigan is not allowing that to happen. So we're out. See you later. That's what we got to do differently. We must invest in our communities. Over 85%, when you look across the country, 85% of the GDP is generated in what I'm calling our metro areas, but I don't mean Detroit and Grand Rapids. I'm talking about the Mount Pleasant, all of our developed areas. That's 85% of our GDP comes out of those areas. It's good business to invest our resources in those areas. And that's how we've got to start thinking about this, as an investment in our future. It has the ability to change our future, and we've got to think of it that way. So just really quick, 'cause I know that we had some folks that want to talk behind me here, but what have we been doing? So we've been having lots of meetings with the administration, with legislators, advocating across these three buckets, as we've called them, trying to get folks to understand why this is so important, why it's worth the time and the energy. A lot of this stuff is big lift stuff. We recognize that, but we think the stakes are high enough that it warrants that. And I will say, to everyone's credit, we are having more and better conversations than we've ever had around this issue. So we're encouraged that we continue to do that, and we're very excited to continue those conversations. We're doing a lot of this. We're trying to get folks to understand why they should care. You know, we've spent a lot of time talking to each other about this stuff. And that's probably not as important as getting folks that live in the communities, work in the communities to understand why they should care about this, because this impacts all of you. No one wants to move to a place that doesn't work. No one wants to locate a business in a place that doesn't work. And a place can't work if we're not resourcing it properly. So that's what everyone's got to remember. We're all kind of all in this together. We continue to develop policies around this so as these conversations take place, we're not just showing up with nothing to say. We've been working on some draft legislation. Hopefully we'll see some of that start to move its way through. And again, lots of education and outreach, because this is a very complicated issue, very difficult for folks to understand. And so we're doing everything we can, bringing as much resources to bear to get folks to understand this stuff. We've commissioned a few independent reports. Here's a couple of them. The one on the left actually is a very detailed, if you want to understand the numbers, that's a great report for you. If you're not a geek, you might like the other one better. I forgot I pointed at the one I can see, not you can see. That one gets at some of the economic arguments around what I was just talking about. It lays out what we call the economic case for place, why this stuff is important. It's measurable and it's tangible. Creating better places pays real economic benefits. And that report talks about that. We've got a third one that's not up there. It's kind of a 4-pager, light read, but it sort of lays out the stuff as well. We've also created a website. It's called SaveMICity.org. We have tons of information out there. I mean, if this is your thing and you want to dive in and swim around for days, you could do that. Lots of information and research. We blog occasionally, do different things to get folks to understand the issue more. So we encourage you to do that as well. And then I'm going to skip the questions part because we're actually going to hand off, and you're going to get some local perspective now. And when they're done talking, then we'll all kind of come back up here, and I'd love to answer any questions you have, as well as I know they would like to do the same. So thanks.
Okay, I want to give you a little bit of perspective about the city of Mount Pleasant. And our general fund is where these dollars are talking about. In our 2017 budget, the revenue is $12.3 million, and we're the typical city, like Tony mentioned. 47% of that comes from property taxes, and 22% is in that green area, which is the state share revenue. So if you add those two together, that 69% of our budget comes from sources that we are either subject to the state legislature appropriating for us or subject to the laws that limit what our revenues will be. Our expenditures by division, 53% of our expenditures go to the public safety, which is typical. And being a service organization that we are, 70% of our budget comes from compensation to our employees. The budget impacts from state share revenue decreases and taxable value are shown on this chart. The state share revenue on the left, you'll see that majority of the years had negative a reduction in our state share revenue and very minimal increases or flat. And then on the taxable value on the right, it's slight increases, but nowhere near keeping up with the increases in our expenditures. So what budget impact has that had on us? We've been able to balance our budget over the years with our fund balance that we had accumulated over the good years. We've also reduced our general fund staffing by 6, and that's at a hard time when our demand for services is greater now than it ever has been. And we've been looking at how we deliver our services to look for efficiencies. In 2018, we're no longer able to balance our budget based on our fund balance. We have a fund balance that meets our policy, but we don't have excess funds that we're able to balance the deficit between revenue and expenditures. So in 2018, as we start our budget process internally, we're doing that now, and we'll be rolling it out to the community in September to talk about. We'll need to be looking at cutting services and our capital expenditures, and also looking at possibly raising the millage, reallocating the millage, or looking at fees that we charge for our services. We'll go next, Phil.
District Carter next.
Whoops.
Of course, those of you who know the neighborhood know that we're the little guys on the block here. We're only 3,200 population, only about 3 square miles, but we love our little community and we love who we are and what we do. We've been impacted, though, the same as our great neighbors in Alma and Mount Pleasant and everyone in the state. We generally speaking, we are a community that has We love challenges, and we like finding innovative ways to those challenges. But on the fiscal side, we are generally fiscally conservative and very liberally and open-minded about approaching those challenges. And that and the fund balance that Mary Ann just showed you, shared with you in Mount Pleasant, is essentially what has got us past through these these last 10, 12 years. This slide, I only have two of them. This one showing our revenue sharing, and it's indicative of what my neighbors have said. And Tony's slide showed that we lost $1.4 million since they started tracking this in 2002. And coincidentally, that's almost the exact amount of what our fund balance was when we started this small little challenge. And so we are to the point now where, like Mary Ann shared with you in Mount Pleasant, we think that we are at the point where we can't, our fund balance won't carry us anymore. And what the greatest challenge and our greatest concern is, if another recession comes, as Tony predicted or mentioned anyhow, and I think it's in our history, if you follow history at all, they are cyclical, and we'll probably endure one again. Nobody can predict when. My crystal ball is broken, but it will likely come, and we won't be able to survive another challenge like we've just endured. And so this is the second slide I've got, and it shows that our taxable values, and we think we're on the right path. A couple years ago, 3 years ago, we were critical. We weren't affected as adversely as many communities, particularly our big neighbors down the southeast part of Michigan were, because the top line shows assessed value and the bottom line, taxable value, of course, our two never touched. And assessed value, of course, drives down taxable value because your taxable value can never exceed your assessed value. So we were in a good position where we had a good split starting and going into this recession, and it's starting to split again, and our taxable value is starting to slowly decline. So we're optimistic about the future, but the challenges remain there. And again, our biggest concern is if we ever have to face another recession in the near term, we just flat don't know how we're going to do it without something be changed.
Put it here.
Maybe not.
Break it, Phil.
I'll go do it manually.
This is a chart which City of Alma developed in 1998. That's the year that the Total Refinery announced that they were closing, and we started keeping track of what was happening with our budget. The red line is the city's general fund. Right now, and this includes all revenues. This includes all grants, all one-time. We had the one big spike you see it there. Total Petroleum had a supplemental environmental project. They violated some EPA rules, and in return, they had to clean up something. That money came to us. We oversaw the project. That's why it spiked up. We didn't have a choice as how it's to be spent. We just had to oversee how it was spent. More recent, last couple of years, that went up. We received a grant for $1 million. Again, that was earmarked for one thing, which is the reason why it's up. But if you look at that, go to the next slide, please. The blue is what our budget was in 1998. There's a little thin bar, which is a slightly different color, which I entitled growth. Our budget has grown since 1998, 6.6%. Meanwhile, over that time frame, the CPI index inflation has increased by approximately 46%. So we've lost approximately 40% of our purchasing power over that time period. Meanwhile, the state budget has increased by almost 60% over that same time frame, which shows you that the state is making choices as to where the money is going. And clearly, it has not been to the cities. It's going to other places other than municipalities. For the city of Alma, our goal has been for some time is that we realize that long-term, this just not work. If we've had 20 years of virtually no growth, the odds of it changing the next 20 years unless something dramatically changes is not going to happen. If we just continue doing the same thing, we're going to be at the same spot we are right now. And our goal has been not to outrun the bear, but to outrun our friends, which means that we're hoping that Clare and Mount Pleasant fail before us so that maybe somebody will come to our rescue. I'm not sure that's a very good strategy.
It's not.
If you take the next slide.
I don't think there was another one.
Okay. Hit it a couple more times, see if it shows. There we go. That one.
Oh, there, okay.
The current budget, you may have read about it in the newspaper. It's been fairly controversial locally. We've been using some fund balance to balance our budget, and that is not a long-term strategy that works. If we do nothing, if you look at the red line, that's where we're headed. We're headed down, and this is what we call the best case scenario, the rosy scenario, assuming nothing goes wrong, assuming that there are no downturns in the state government, assuming that the state continues to fund revenue sharing, assuming all those things, we crash and burn in 2023. That's the best case, and it's probably not even quite that rosy because in 2021 or 2022, we're going to start having cash flow problems because our revenue doesn't come in an even stream. We need some money just to operate, and so we know we have a problem. If you may have read in the paper, I've recommended that we reduce our police force by 3. That does not solve our problem. I'm just hoping it solves it enough that I can outrun these 2 cities so that they fail before we do. We don't have many options. In terms of revenue, the only ones that I can see that are potentially viable is we could go to the voters to look for an income tax. I think Mount Pleasant did that, and that didn't go very far because it's very politically unpopular. We've talked about it, and if you want to get people to show up to your public meetings, you talk about the income tax. It's not, I'm not sure it's a viable option. The other one, the city to the east of us, St. Louis, is looking at doing a special assessment on every parcel in town for public safety. That's the only other option, but I suspect that's going to have the same impact that we'll have our city hall filled with every time that we talk about that. If nothing changes, we're going to have a very serious problem. We know it's going to be a problem. The question is just how quickly do we want to crash and burn?
So on that happy note, we're now going to turn it over to you if you have any questions for the group as a whole. We would ask that you come up to the microphone because we're taping this so that it can be reshown later. So if you have any general questions you'd like to ask, you can come up to the microphone and one of the panel members will answer it. If you have individual questions, I'm sure these guys will stay around afterwards if you want to do a one-on-one question. But at this point, we'll open it up to the microphone for whoever wants to be brave and go first. Mm-hmm. We may have to turn it on, Tony. Thank you.
All I read and all I see in the news is the race to the bottom in Lansing. Nobody's talking about reallocating funds to local units of government. We've got to cut that goddamn state income tax. We got to cut it back so everybody gets a 30-cent check, and that's going to make the economy hum like this. I'm so pessimistic about this. I just want to scream.
I'd like to address that because when you look at what the state's talking about with that, basically that income tax cut that they're talking about is money that should have gone into state shared revenue. And, basically what they're talking about is just cutting our funds to make the legislatures look good. If they really want to do something, they need to cut their own money, not our money.
Yeah, I mean, and you make a good point. the most popular thing any politician could say is, I'm going to cut taxes, right? Yeah, everyone builds a statue of you, and it feels good to say that. I think part of our job is to get people to understand the cost of that. What's the opportunity cost of that relatively small change in our income tax or whatever it might be? Because when you add those things up, they become real. And those are dollars that could make a difference in thinking about where we invest those resources. If you look at the data around Michigan's sort of total tax burden, we're a very, very competitive state when you look at that by just about any measure. We used to be not as attractive. I mean, there was a time we were probably in that top quartile. Now I think we're in the bottom. So I don't think there's a real need to look at further tax cuts, even if that's sort of the side of the fence that you tend to lean to do that. I do think it's the time to look now for investment opportunities and, again, transform Michigan. And because our economy, again, it will not survive if our communities are all in disarray. People don't move to a state. They move to a place. We need to invest in those places. I don't know if anyone else wants to add any thoughts around that.
Good evening. You continually say that you think we shouldn't be investing into our communities. And as a city commissioner, when we look at our budgets, when we look at our capital improvement plans, and we have to make decisions about investing in our communities, can you help us prioritize when you say invest in the community? That obviously doesn't mean just like throw a bunch of money at everything. How can we help make decisions about the things that are going to actually make an impact and make us more attractive?
So that's a great question. First of all, when I make that comment, I'm really speaking more to sort of our statewide fiscal policies. Rather than looking for opportunities to further diminish those revenues, kind of back to the tax cut question, we could continue to try to be the cheapest, and that's one strategy. I think that's a strategy we've largely employed. We have essentially decided if you balance your budget, then you're doing well. That's sort of become the de facto measuring stick for communities. And so that makes the Flints bad and the Mount Pleasant's good because, one's balanced, one isn't. That's not the right way of looking at it. So we have to think about how do we utilize those resources and do that. So to do that comes back to this overlying thing. We need to change our system. Our system isn't built to invest. We haven't built it that way. We don't think about it that way. And we continue to fight over the scraps for some of this stuff. We could think differently and prioritize where we send those limited resources dollars. Because again, if, in a magical if place where there's 14 million peoples here, I'm at my kid's baseball game tonight instead of here talking to y'all. So no offense. But because we haven't done that, and we see the result of that. We have not done the things we need to do to remain competitive with our neighboring states. We've done it on taxes. We've done it on a lot of the other things. We haven't done it on providing the resources to our community. So that's what I mean when I say that. The cop-out answer I'm going to give you to your specific question, though, is that's what's so great about being a local official is every place is different. And every place is trying to create a service offering that matches their community, and so it's going to look different and be equally amazing from place to place if they're resourced properly. Some communities provide lots of recreational services and their community wants it, expects it, and demands it. Others don't. Some places want to have less services and maybe pay a little bit less in taxes. There's no magic formula except one, and it's got to be a great place that people care about, that they feel good about, that they want to remain a part of. That's the only thing that really matters, and that's different. That's why when you drive around the state or country or whatever, places are different because different people, if I ask that question, picture that perfect community, place, neighborhood, everyone's got a different image in their mind, and that's okay because we can create all those places, and those places know who they are. And so what we haven't done is resource them to do that, and that's what we've got to set about doing, I think. I mean, you guys probably have far greater than I that local perspective of the things that you know in your town that you're not able to do that maybe you were doing before. I don't know if you guys have any examples of some of that stuff.
I know that in Alma, we have, I look at our park system. For many, many years, we're very, very proud of our park system. But because of our budget woes, we've, over the last 15 years, we've essentially cut our public works department in half. And that means that we do a lot less maintenance in our park system, which means that it's just not quite as shiny, quite as nice, quite as welcoming as it once was. And there are just all sorts of areas you can look at. You know, you look at the streets. You know, our streets are failing in this state. And I know the legislature took action to help that, but that's not going to fix the problem. We still have a lot of issues out there that need to be fixed.
I would agree with what you said, Tony. I think it's really what the community wants, and that's why we have local units of government, and that's why we have local elected officials to be able to provide the services that our individual communities want. So we need to be investing in those things so that our residents want to stay here and want to attract others to come here. So I don't know that there's a one-size-fits-all answer.
I agree with my colleagues. I've been in Clare almost 2 decades now, and the greatest testimony I think I've received, or the greatest compliment I think received about our little town, it was in a recent conversation with a recently retired couple from, a professional couple from southeast Michigan, and asked them, why did you choose Clare? I mean, you could have gone any place. And they said they were looking for Mayberry RFD, and they found it. And I don't think we've had a better complement of that's what we want to be. That was our vision. That's been our vision all along. We love being neighbors with Mount Pleasant, where you got your Walmarts and all that good stuff. And you can be any place in the state in 2 hours and go to the big cities, and we love big cities for what they are. But when I come home at night, and I've lived in large cities all over the world and endured hour-and-a-half commutes on a daily basis, on a busy day in Clare, it takes me 6 minutes to get to work. And so that's the environment we want, and that's the environment we're trying to keep. But to do that is a daily challenge, and we need revenues to do that, and we're in the same boat that our larger colleagues are, no different. We're a full-service city. We have 24/7 police, fire department, recs, airport. We provide all those services, but all those services cost money. And as I indicated earlier, in our particular case, we used fund balance to make sure that we didn't cut our services. But even doing so, we still had to, we reduced our staffing by almost 20%. And we can't cut anymore without cutting services. And we can't go forward unless our revenues increase. And so that's the dilemma that we face.
Another dilemma that cities are facing is trying to maintain our level of service. You know, we either have to cut or raise our millage, and every time we raise that millage, it's driving people out of town, because I can go live just the other side of that line in the township, and I can pay 4 mills, and I can come into the city and use all your services for free, and that doesn't quite seem quite fair.
It's not. And that is a problem around the state. And that's you know, it's not on our hit list of things, but it's absolutely an issue that I hear that exact story in countless places around the state. People will take the stuff for free and go across the imaginary line and do that. And so some of that does come back, though, to that, how do we structure the services part of that? And part of that conversation probably needs to extend to how do we pay for some of those services, because what we have, without any question, is an inequitably built system right now. I think when constructed, you know, 100 years ago, no one envisioned it being in the way that it is now, and now it's being worked, I think, to the detriment of some communities. It's one of their colleagues downstate, interesting dilemma. So neighboring township, and they provide police service until 6 o'clock. And at 7 o'clock, and in that township, they have Ken had mentioned the Walmart. They have a big Walmart there. They're not paying for police protection. So the city gets the call and says there's a disturbance in this Walmart, and they're faced with the choice of, do I say, not my problem, and let something bad potentially happen, or do they respond without compensation for doing that? And this particular community has consistently elected B rather than A, but the economics are becoming so out of balance that it may soon become A, and that could be a tragic circumstance. So all of that is part of the conversation, I think, and how you do it. I don't have a magic answer to that. I don't know if you guys face some of that stuff in your areas as well, but.
That's a very real problem. In fact, with the budget that I've just presented, I'm actually getting more complaints from people that don't live in the city than people that do live in the city.
It's hard to top that comment right there.
I just had this one observation I wanted to add to the issues that were presented regarding municipal finance as it relates to state financing. This is a point that whenever the subject matter has come up, it was something that I'd like to, illustrate, how far we've come in this state. And also I would just point out how the numbers I'm about to offer, it could be old data, so if you have any, clarification or amplification to what I'm about to say, I would appreciate that. But, back in 1978, when the Headley Amendment passed, the first limit from the Headley Amendment, that provision in the state constitution, is that the state of Michigan, the size of the state of Michigan is limited to about 9.5% of personal income. And so now in the many years since, we're down to, as if I remember right, about 7.5%. But what's the real, number in between? At the greatest point, it was about $8 billion. And so that is a huge amount of money relative to, some of the things that, we expect from the state of Michigan. In the, decades ago, for example, colleges were supported by the state of Michigan to the extent where tuition paid only about 20%, and then the state of Michigan paid about 80%. Now that's flipped. We had the single business tax in the state back then, and that provided a significant more amount of revenue relative to what we have now, where the tax burden is probably greater on the individual. And so I bring all that up, for the purpose of coloring how we've made the choices in this state to effectively, limit the revenue that we get statewide, and that has the consequence of, balancing the budgets, in different places, that effectively, create a bigger burden, for the local unit of government relative to the state government. If there's any other information that you could add to that, I would appreciate that.
Yeah, so another point that you didn't mention about the Headley Amendment, which is very interesting, and one of the challenges I have as I talk about this is I could talk about this topic for the next 3 hours and you'd all kill yourself, but how much information is too much information. Another sort of little known fact about the Headley Amendment was when it passed, because again, Mr. Headley, when he did this, he absolutely wanted to put limits on local revenue growth, and probably appropriately so. But he also wanted to put in protections. And so one of those protections was the unfunded mandates we talked about. The other protection that was put in place was the proportion of state revenues that were going to local governments at that time. It was never supposed to fall below that threshold. It was roughly 50%, a little bit less. When Proposal A passed, and we raised the sales tax from 4% to 6%, the state took all those additional dollars and essentially only changed half the fraction and said, well, now we're funding, you're well above that threshold, because school revenues, by the way, are part of local revenues in that definition. So they included those dollars in the calculation of, are we above that quote-unquote Headley threshold, which put them way above, which enabled them to defund for the real dollars that were coming out of the state budget. The cuts have been so dramatic, we're actually approaching that limit. So that may actually put a floor, if nothing else. That situation has gotten so out of fact. There's actually been a lawsuit that's been filed by a handful of communities, mostly in Southeast Michigan, challenging that, the way the state implemented that change. Their arguments are interesting. When I when I first heard about it, I thought, this is kind of crazy uncle, writing this stuff. But if you read through it, there's really some pretty compelling arguments around some of this stuff. I don't know what will ultimately happen with it, but I think it speaks to how broken the system is, that we're down to suing each other over constitutional interpretations of what funding means for local government. We've just got to be smarter with the resources that we have and invest those in a way that are going to bring about true change for us.
Hello, how are you? I've got a question. Mount Pleasant's, I guess, decision to opt in to House Bill 4209's outline program. In your opinion, do you think that that is a important, I suppose, stepping stone to help fix Mount Pleasant, and as well as Clare also? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to punt on it and then maybe if I know a little more, I'll.
I just
jump
want to
in,
make
but-
sure I'm clear. Is House Bill 4209 the Medical Marijuana Facilities Licensing Act? Yes. Okay. So, as you indicated, the Mount Pleasant City Commission is looking at opting into that and has put up a task force to decide which of those facilities the city wants to opt into. And there's a number of reasons why the City Commission is looking into that, but one of them that has been articulated is what you indicated, the potential for additional revenue growth because of the fees that can be charged and the sharing of the taxes that are generated from it. But I think that's just one of many reasons why Mount Pleasant is looking at that as an option. Ken may want to comment on Clare's perspective of that.
Certainly. I think Clare was, at least in the region, we were one of the first municipalities that opted in. But please, I ask that you not take that as the city's endorsement necessarily of medical marijuana. Certainly that was directed by popular vote anyhow. Our reason for opting in was primarily driven by property owners' rights. We believe very strongly that every property owner should be able to use his property to the maximum ability possible. And so we want to give them every option to do that. And that's why we opted in initially. But we did put restrictions on it, and we only allow that type of use for all 5 of the presently authorized medical marijuana facilities in districts in the city that are zone industrial or industrial park. We do not in any way envision that this is going to be a revenue savior. In fact, it's going to be taxed just like any other industrial building. And with the exception of the provisioning center, we don't really receive any direct revenue from the state other than in the provisioning center, what is today called a dispensary. The state will, they take 25% of the, no, I'm sorry, they take 3% of the total revenue of a provisioning center, and 25 of that 3% is returned to the local government. So we don't view it as a cash cow, and that was not our rationale or our justification for opting in.
I was just wondering if it was viewed as another tool to add to your toolbox.
Well, certainly we, within the moral restrictions of our community and what our planning commission, city commission, our elected officials determine, we use, and we have historically, we used every available tool out there. We didn't look directly at that as another tool, but certainly it is. It's economic development, sure.
Yeah, so now I understand your question a little better. I mean, it is a tool, but I mean, again, I think most of the policy development around that, the revenue piece of that is relatively small. So some of the, just to give you maybe a better, deeper answer on some of the different tool things, you go around the country, there are different economic development tools they have. For example, in, I think it's South Carolina, businesses can actually vote to impose a tax on themselves if they wanted to do a project. Now, the city has to sign off on it, but if they wanted to do, say they wanted to put a park downtown because they understand the economic benefit of having the activity associated with that, and they want to impose a tax upon themselves. They have the ability to do that. We don't have tools like that in Michigan. So there are different things we could do that would, again, it'd be local determination type things, but which have the opportunity to have a different conversation. Going back to what I said earlier, everyone in Mount Pleasant could vote to do something. If that statutory authority doesn't exist, that vote doesn't matter, right? So why not provide some of those options? Let's identify some of those other things that we can point to that have worked in other places, and let's make those available for our cities here as well. Anybody else? I mean, I'll just say for my part, I mean, it's really appreciated to have the opportunity to talk to folks and showing the interest in this stuff. This is arguably one of the most important conversations we're going to be engaged with over this entire legislative session. And truly, I think that the future of Michigan hangs in the balance on some of this stuff. And it's not easy. It's very complicated, and it's very difficult issues to deal with. But the choice of not dealing with them, I think, is even more difficult. So I do want to give, again, some props. I gave a little bit in the presentation, but I want to go back and say this now. There has been more conversation in Lansing around these issues in the last year than there's probably been in the last decade. So that is encouraging. Now, having said that, that's a long way from spiking the ball in the end zone. So we would encourage, I would encourage all of you to stay engaged on this. I mean, if the stuff you heard tonight resonated and had any sort of impact, you know, put it in your words. Talk to your legislator, talk to your friends, talk to your business owners that you deal with. Get them to understand that this is a real issue and something that folks need to pay attention with. If you thought I was full of hot air, then sorry for wasting 2 hours of your evening. But it's a very important issue, and it's important that folks that aren't sitting up here understand it and engage on it. I think, again, it's critical to our future. So I don't know if you guys have any other sort of parting thoughts.
I was just going to say thank you to you for coming to our community to make this presentation. Thanks for our neighbors for joining us in it. And most importantly, thanks to you for showing an interest in your local communities. We will stay around if you have other questions, or you also know where we all work, so feel free to give us a call if you think of something on your way home. We'd be glad to help you out with anything. I'll see if do you guys have anything to add? Thank you very much. Have a great evening.